Hi, my name is Kristen Chrisman, and welcome to the final episode of the grand finale, where I'm going to summarize the entire Paradigm for Peace model that we've been going over. Paradigm for Peace model is largely about nonviolence, and it's about understanding. And this poster that I created long ago, shortly after 9/11, shows 3 facets of solutions that we'll be talking about: first, second, and third facets. And a big point of Paradigm for Peace is to look at human development, our abilities to communicate and understand one another and love one another and make friends as the most important pathway towards peace. Not the physical control so much, but and also looking at justice, creating real fairness. A key to Paradigm for Peace, to understanding it, it's an attitude and it's an approach. This is a big part, that caring for the other side does not equal appeasement. Caring for the other side, it's almost like a bad word, as if, oh, you're appeasing them. It's not appeasement. And satisfying the enemy's legitimate grievances is also not appeasement. It's a good thing to do. If you always say, oh, we can't do that because that's appeasement, you're going to be a very uncooperative nation, which is what the U.S. is. And another big point of my model is that one-sided empathy is dangerous. We need to develop 360-degree empathy, understanding and caring for all sides of conflict, not just for one side, loving one and hating and killing the other. Okay, we have to move well beyond that. So first, we'll look at the first element of the Paradigm for Peace model, which is the roots of violence. And in the Paradigm for Peace model, we look at both the defensive roots of violence and the aggressive roots of violence on both sides. Meaning, defensive root of violence, I'm using violence to save my life, to defend myself. Or I'm using violence to save my home. Aggressive violence, oh, I'm using violence to steal your home. Okay? So first, we'll look at the first category we look at in the Paradigm for Peace model, and we're going to look at 5 categories today. It's called life and safety. So how do Russia, Putin, and the allied Ukrainians feel life and safety are threatened, and how is that provoking their violence? Big reason is right here. NATO missiles. I mean, they're even over in Poland and Romania. Who knows next? They might go into the Ukraine, the Black Sea. Putin says this feels like a knife at our throat. Some missiles can arrive at Moscow in 5 minutes. But the U.S. just tells Russia, trust us. Another threat is the violence to life from the civil war that's been waging in Ukraine since 2014. Since the 2014 coup, 14,000 have been killed. Yet NATO and the U.S. continue to send them arms. The U.S. has been sending arms from the government-to-government sales since 2017, but there were direct commercial sales from U.S. corporations approved by the Department of State and Defense since 2015. It's been a proxy war. Other threats to life exist from ultranationalists, including neo-Nazis, who commit ugly forms of violence against many groups, including feminists, gays, Romani, Jews, and Russian Ukrainians. In Odessa, about 200 people were injured. Many were killed when they were trapped in a building. After a peaceful protest, there came a conflict. They were attacked, trapped in a building, and the building was set on fire. And this has not even been investigated. Also, Putin states, and I find this also online, nuns, monks, and priests have been attacked in an Orthodox church by ultranationalist Ukrainians. So we have to empathize and really take much more time than that to talk to Putin and other Russians, to really feel their fears and how upsetting it is to live with these threats to their lives, instead of trivializing these threats. To make real peace, we've got to have this kind of social evolution where we can care about the so-called enemy's fears. Then, down here, we look at the fears to the U.S., or U.S. policymakers at least, NATO, and the allied Ukrainians on their side. And they have fears of life from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously. People being killed. Cold War fears still exist and haunt the brains. Fears of the past that the Soviet Union is going to attack Western Europe, or fears that the Soviets are instigating reform movements worldwide. Then, of course, there's fears from the Civil War violence and Russia's alleged invasion of Crimea. I don't know whether it was actually an invasion or not, but I'm calling it here an alleged invasion, but there's fears from life from that episode. Then, second category, power and freedom. How do threats to power and freedom cause Russia, Putin, and allied Ukrainians to wage violence? Why does it cause them to wage violence? Well, in what ways are their power and freedom threatened? Most obviously by the U.S.-supported 2014 coup in Ukraine. It was undemocratic. It was a violation of sovereignty. It was not done for the sake of Ukrainians. And the protests, which began peacefully and which were understandably against the corruption of the government, were hijacked by ultranationalists, and it turned into a violent coup. Fears of multiple CIA and other coups by the National Endowment for Democracy are instigated by them. They've instigated political and economic turmoil, labor unrest, protests. They do character assassination with the help of the U.S. media, and also CIA links with media around the world. U.S. denying the validity of the referendums going on right now. That's a threat to power and freedom. Here they are having these referendums. They very well may be valid, but the U.S. is automatically denying them. That's a threat to power and freedom. NATO domination. We talked about that as a threat to life. It's also a threat to power and freedom, especially to the EU. And then this U.S.-led rules-based order and unipolar world where many U.S. policymakers are on the road to enforcing this idea that the U.S. is the nation that should be making the rules because the U.S. is the civilized nation that knows what it's doing and everyone else should be following. That's very threatening because it's actually not in the interest of the world. It's the interest of certain social circles of Americans who run U.S. foreign policy. Now, we have to sink into those shoes, spend a lot of time really feeling that sincerely and understanding that. Then we get into the shoes of the U.S. policymakers, NATO, and allied Ukrainians. How do they feel that their power and freedom are threatened? So, we have fears of Putin allegedly subverting democracy in Europe, the U.S., and worldwide. We see that in the media all the time and online. Oh, Putin subverting democracy. Frankly, I think that's propaganda. But it's a fear, and whether it's rational or irrational, we should listen to it, feel their fear, understand them, and if we think it's irrational, let's investigate it with them. Because if it is irrational, wouldn't that make them feel better? Unless they're making it up to support their cause. But some people, I think, really believe that. Putin's alleged imperial goals in Crimea, Donetsk, and Lugansk. Putin's alleged goal to dissolve Ukraine. Again, many of my essays were devoted to the fact that U.S. quote-unquote experts were saying that Putin's essay and his speeches make it clear that he has imperial aims in Donetsk and Lugansk in Ukraine and that he wants to dissolve Ukraine. And I show that this is absolutely false. He does not say this at all in his speeches and his essay. So frankly, I think that entire thing is propaganda because everything they say to support that is they point to Putin's speech and essays, which do not say that. But we still have to look into it. If they fear that, we can't just say, oh, that's stupid. I mean, the U.S. says that to Putin. When Putin fears NATO, they just say, oh, that's stupid. Okay, but we shouldn't do that, and we shouldn't do it here either. If people are fearing Putin's alleged imperial goals, let's look into it with them, investigate it with them. And if we can find that it's not true, they should be relieved. If we find that it is true, well, then we should be relieved that we uncovered that fact. Lack of representation is a fear, especially amongst ultranationalists in Ukraine. They feel they're not fairly represented in the Ukrainian government. So, ultranationalists, neo-Nazis, we have to listen to them also. We have to put our feet into the shoes of all of these people to understand what's driving them. And first of all, we look at their fears. There's probably other things driving all these people too, right? Greed, aggression, rivalry. But we have to look at the fears first. Then, there's this belief that if the U.S. doesn't set the rules, others will allegedly set the rules in a bad way. I think that's paranoia, but we should look into it, see how true it is, how false it is, and listen to their fear, listen to the evidence they have. Why do they think this way? And a similar fear, a fear that Russia will allegedly fill in any vacuum of power. It's a very important one to look into, really listen to them, and see, because that is why NATO was going east across Europe, thinking if we don't go east, Russia's going to come west. Next category, wealth, land, and possessions. That's a big one. So what are the fears? Russia, Putin, and allied Ukrainians fear a loss of the energy market in Europe because the U.S. has been trying to kick them out for decades. Pipelines being shut down. U.S. liquefied natural gas being pushed. U.S. rival pipelines, like in Georgia. We talked about this, how a coup took place in Russia, probably supported by the U.S., which caused Georgia's deals with Russia pipelines to be turned off, and Georgia's deals with U.S. pipelines to be turned on. So there's this fear that the U.S. is pushing them out very forcefully and unjustly. Fear of loss of fossil fuel access to the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, the U.S. under the Clinton administration jumped over there to the Caspian Sea to try to get their companies getting the fossil fuels out of there. And now with the proxy war going on in Ukraine, there's an obvious attempt by the U.S. government to get access to the Black Sea. Massive fossil fuel deposits. So there's fear on the part of Russia of losing that, which is understandable. That's those seas are on their borders. It's as if we were losing something from Lake Michigan or the Caribbean Sea. Fear of sanctions and frozen assets going on right now. Fear of abuse of foreign investment in Ukraine and in Russia. That happened in the 1990s, and there's a fear that that's what the U.S. policymakers are really after. Putin talks about this in Ukraine, the idea of Americans cannibalizing Ukraine for their own benefit, and then trying to get at Russia too. When Putin renationalized the energy, defense, and banking sectors in Russia, I think that caused U.S. policymakers to think of him as an evil person too, because I think they wanted more access to those markets. Okay, what are the U.S. fears and NATO fears with regard to wealth, land, and possessions? Frankly, I see these fears more as aggressive, and we'll talk about them under aggressive roots of violence, but here, let's think of them as defensive fears, which would have to be framed in terms of loss of potential profit in Europe's energy market, in the Black and Caspian Sea fossil fuels, investments in Ukraine and Russia that they want, Arctic trade in fossil fuels. There's concern now that, Russia has too much domination up there in the Arctic, even though it covers like half the Arctic Circle. Russia's renationalized energy, defense, and banking sectors. Some U.S. policymakers may see this as a defensive fear, that, that those sectors really belong to us. We should have been able to invest in there. Dollar hegemony, fear of losing dollar hegemony, which gives a lot of power to the United States, especially if the dollar is the main currency in the energy markets. And corruption. Corruption is a concern on both sides. Next category, values and identity. What does Russia fear? Fear of the spread of unpleasant parts of the U.S. culture and values, extremes, the excessive permissiveness of American culture, U.S. commercialization and homogenization. These aren't factoring in as major parts of this current conflict, however, but this is. Attacks by ultranationalists and neo-Nazis on the Orthodox Church, people and buildings. I mean, Nazi symbols have been plastered on these Orthodox churches in Ukraine. legal attacks on the Russian language and literature, meaning using the law to attack the Russian language and literature and ban it from school curriculum in Ukraine. There's a draft law in Ukraine for English to become the dominant, to become Ukraine's international language, displacing Russian. Okay, what about U.S. fears in this conflict? Well, U.S. fears Russia's legal attacks on the Ukrainian language, meaning Russia using law to diminish the use of Ukrainian in schools in Donetsk and Lugansk and Crimea. Of course, the population's mainly Russian in Crimea especially. Putin's alleged cultural homogenization in Russia. That's been a complaint about Putin. Putin's alleged attack on civilization and democratic values. I think that's hogwash. I think that's part of the U.S. propaganda. But it's important, whether it's irrational or rational or just a planted lie. Let's look at it. If it is a lie, let's really expose how it's a lie. If it's not, okay, let's find out what's true about it, if there's something to be alarmed here. Last category that we'll look at with regard to this conflict is love, worth, and friendship. An entirely ignored conflict, always ignored in U.S. foreign policy. But it's very big in this conflict, very big. Fears on the Russian side of anti-Russia attitudes deliberately instigated by post-coup Ukrainian government and even prior to the 2014 coup by Western powers. Putin remembers even prior to the coup how Western powers were trying to push Ukraine not to just join with the EU or have ties with the U.S., but to sever ties with Russia. So it's very hostile. Loss, fears of loss of social, emotional, cultural, and spiritual ties with Ukraine. This is what Putin is talking about in his essay when he says that we're one people, or when he talks about unity. He's not saying we should be combined politically. He's not saying we should dissolve national borders. He's saying this isn't right, that Ukrainians should be taught to hate Russia, to fear Russia, and to cut our spiritual ties through the church, our cultural ties through our languages, our emotional and social ties. This is very painful and hostile, and it's not right. It's a very big part of the conflict. But the U.S. media twists it. Anti-Russian hatred and prejudice in the U.S. during the Cold War, in the U.S. media, and in TV shows. It's also very hurtful how Russians are portrayed in the media and in the fictional movies. The U.S. side fears about loss of love, worth, and friendship. I don't know that this plays a big part at all. All I suggest is there's a possible deep down fear of a lack of popularity and friendship on the part of the U.S. internationally, and so maybe this is causing the U.S. to impose its power and culture on others. It's like poor social skills and trying to make friends and try to be loved. It's forcing itself upon others. That's what I see. You will like me. So those are the defensive roots of violence, which are all being ignored, especially the Russian Putin and allied Ukrainian fears. These are all being ignored by the U.S. media and policymakers. And we turn this around to look at aggressive roots of violence. And notice, I don't have anything on the top. There probably are aggressive behaviors occurring within Russia towards Ukraine or amongst allied Ukrainians. But I don't know what they are, so I'm leaving that blank. I'm much more familiar with the aggressive behaviors. And I think instead of calling this aggressive roots of violence, it's better to call it perhaps aggressive behaviors. And so others are welcome to fill these in, but honestly, I don't see aggression on this side. I don't see it. It might be there, but if it is there, I don't see it as a big part in this conflict. But I do see a lot of U.S. government aggression going on. So I'd see under life and safety, like how is the U.S. aggressively threatening others' lives? With the NATO expansion into Slavic lands. With the weapon shipments to Ukraine since 2015. Sabotaging the Minsk agreements. It's been a proxy war. This was not an unprovoked Russian invasion. The U.S. was waging proxy war ever since that coup, beginning with the coup. Project for a New American Century, PNAC, their document in 2000. I mean, is very aggressive. They're defunct now, but their ideas live on, and the people in PNAC have influential positions. For just one example, that in the document from 2000, they talk about the excitement. With excitement, they talk about the bioweapons being developed to target certain genotypes. Can you imagine that? Attacking a certain type, a certain race. It's genocide. Also, ultranationalist violence going on, hushed up by the U.S. media, denied by the U.S. media. That's a lie, because it exists. Human rights groups talk about it. The ultranationalists, which include neo-Nazis, have been violent against the Romani, the Russians, Jews, gays, and feminists. And as I say in an earlier essay, not all ultranationalists are violent, okay, and not all ultranationalists are neo-Nazis, but the group includes violent members, okay. So you want to listen to them and hear their fears, but be aware of the violence going on, which has been very provoking. Okay, more aggression with regard to power and freedom. How is the U.S. side and NATO side aggressively threatening the other side legitimate needs for power and freedom? And one way is, again, it's talked about in the PNAC document of 2000. It reeks of desires for U.S. hegemony. It reeks of the belief that the U.S. should be the one setting the rules, or else other nations will set the rules in ways that are not good. They're convinced of that. They say how the open oceans are America's. The Pacific bases are the new U.S. frontier. Again, I mean, one of the founders of PNAC is the husband of Victoria Nuland, who's Biden's Undersecretary of State. And she was involved in the coup. She was on tape. They caught her on tape talking about who was going to be the next leader of Ukraine. And that leader hadn't even been toppled yet. But she was talking with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt. But her husband was the founder of PNAC. Thomas Barnett, I talk about his book, Pentagon's New Map. Very popular in the Pentagon is what I have heard. And he talks about enforcing globalization around the world, and enforcing the core nations' rules. He calls the nations that have globalized the functioning core nations. And he thinks they should be imposing, by force if necessary, globalization on the rest of the world, which he calls the non-integrated gap. And he says that if the U.S. military is put, along this gap, that's the new map, along the line between the functioning core nations and the non-integrated gap, to impose globalization, with war if necessary, killing off those who resist, then eventually we'll have peace. That's the goal. It doesn't make sense that if we wage all this war to impose this value system, then we'll have peace. Okay? NATO expansion is a threat. The idea that NATO shouldn't defer to the European Union is something that PNAC says. National Endowment for Democracy and the CIA, their coup instigation, horrendous. Most recently in Ukraine and Georgia. Well, there's been other ones more recent than that, but with regard to the conflict. That's not talked about. That was very aggressive, undemocratic, illegal. The fact that we don't have any democratic referenda in our country or in other countries with regard to globalization, to the free market system, which I call the unrestrained market system. With regard to war, with regard to weapons manufacturing shipments. Americans don't have a voice. So that's very aggressive on the part of the U.S. policymakers. And the fact that freedom and democracy are redefined. Okay, I'm going to move along more quickly because I've already gone through these actually in another video, so let me just read through them. Wealth, land, and possessions. How is that aggressive? Wilsonian triad. Michael Mandelbaum writes about the belief that free markets are needed for democracy and peace. That very belief is aggressive. The desire to kick Russia out of Europe's market is aggressive, since John D. Rockefeller. The desire to secure access to fossil fuels of the Black and Caspian Seas, that's aggressive. Trying for years to shut down Nord Stream 2, even before it was built. Aggression. Coups in Georgia and Ukraine. aggression. It's to secure U.S. ownership of pipelines and access to fossil fuels. Weapon industry profits from NATO expansion and weapon shipments. That's aggressive. In other words, part of what was driving NATO to expand was the U.S. weapon industry, which wanted to sell its weapons to new NATO members who would be obligated to get rid of their old Soviet weapons, just so that they could buy new ones. U.S. policymakers and donors' financial interests in the weapons and fossil fuels. Center for New American Security has weapon and high-tech donors. That's the organization that Victoria Nuland once CEO'd. And a lot of their donors are the weapon industry. So these are just ties with the top ties between the U.S. policymakers, weapon industry, fossil fuel industry, that are too close for comfort and talk about, they show a conflict of interest, and they show a very insulated mentality. Values and identity. How are these aggressive? Barnett's Pentagon's New Map, his book, Imposing Globalization Worldwide with War. With the idea that this is for their own good. Just as imposing the U.S. civilization upon the Native Americans was supposedly for their own good. Exported values to the trade and entertainment industry is aggressive. Privatization and austerity imposed as conditions of receiving World Bank and IMF loans. That's aggressive. That could have gone under the wealth category, but there wasn't room here. I put it here, but it also connects with values, because once you privatize, you can impose your own values. Austerity also creates a certain value system where you don't care about the poor, you don't care about justice. And then I have question marks here. Are there religious motives also behind this? Are there Final Judgment Day fans who are looking forward to a big, big war that will supposedly lead to the second coming and peace on earth? Lastly, love, worth, and friendship. We have some very aggressive ideas going on here amongst U.S. policymakers. A with us or against us mentality. No neutrality allowed. So the U.S. is demanding of its allies, if you're our friend, you have to be on our side, you can't be against us, and you can't be neutral. You have to be part of this conflict. That's a very demanding, aggressive form of friendship. Aggressive towards other countries and aggressive towards Americans. I have it down here, blacklisting of Americans. And thinking that unity is the same thing as forced homogenization, where if you speak up and say, actually Putin didn't say that, actually Putin has a good idea there, you're thought of as an enemy. Some Americans are being blacklisted just for saying things like that. That's a very aggressive way to relate to Americans. It's aggressive, it's very demanding form of relationship. Compelling Ukraine to create alliances only with the EU, US, and NATO, and to sever alliances with Russia. Again, a very jealous form of friendship. It's not friendship. And then a sense of self-worth dependent upon winning rivalries and making profits. I think that's probably plaguing U.S. policymakers, fossil fuel and weapon industry people who value their own selves depending upon whether they won a rivalry, whether they got the deal, whether they're making the profits. And it's making them very competitive with other industries, with other countries, and then they're not. They have blinders onto the big picture of how their rivalry is stampeding over people and animals and plants and air and water. Pentagon's and NATO's need for purpose and self-worth satisfied with enlarged missions of violence, conquest, and intimidation. Barnett speaks of this, that the Pentagon has been floundering since the supposed end of the Cold War, wanting a sense of mission, how the Persian Gulf War came along just in time to give them a sense of purpose, but it didn't last long. And now they need a new sense of purpose. But that's a terribly aggressive reason to wage a war, because you want a sense of purpose in your organization. That's ridiculous. So those are the defensive roots of violence and the aggressive roots of violence. And I'm moving through it all quickly. Next, the next element we look at are the escalators of violence. Escalators are factors that cause a person to be more likely to choose violence as the way to to handle their defensive fears and their aggressive desires. For example, if somebody's threatening to steal my house from me or my belongings, I won't necessarily use violence. But what if I were to use violence, what makes me use violence? There's certain mental, legal, and physical escalators that might make me more likely to use violence. So we have to look at these in order to create peace, because we also want to address the escalators of violence and diminish them. So first we have mental escalators of U.S. violence. And I've already been through these in an earlier video, so I'm just going to run through them quickly. Blind convictions of the U.S. policymakers' own morality. U.S. propaganda, huge, humongous escalator of violence in this conflict. Anti-Russian prejudice, huge. Competition, rivalry, status, greed, that's huge amongst policymakers and corporations. And then these types of psychological patterns, which I've talked about before, Lakoff's strict model, Alport's prejudiced personality, Spranger's political lenses, negative traits of the parent and child egos, and lack of a wise ego, lack an inability to do impartial analysis, but instead our foreign policy, instead of having the wise ego where you analyze the information impartially and comprehensively, get all sorts of information, the policymakers are ruled by the negative traits of the child ego, meaning they're aggressive, fearful, self-centered, self-indulgent, and by the negative traits of the parent ego, meaning they're prejudiced and they're very punitive. That's what's characterizing U.S. foreign policy and has characterized U.S. foreign policy for 245 years. Okay? Those are all mental escalators of violence. And these types of psychological patterns make a person more likely to be not understanding, to think they're right, to impose their authority upon others. Legal escalators of violence. Enabling dysfunctional psychological types to lead U.S. foreign policy. So we've got these psychological patterns, but enabling them to be ruling us. It's a huge legal escalator of violence. Like, why doesn't the campaign process weed these people out? Failure to enforce international law. Huge. For example, the U.S. supported 2014 coup in Ukraine. Why no investigation? Why wasn't anyone held responsible? Why wasn't that taped conversation of Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt investigated in a court or in a hearing? U.S. invasion of Iraq, 2003. No consequences to the U.S. for violating international law. U.S. extrajudicial drone attacks, again, no consequences. Lack of sound decision-making process and democratic control over U.S. shipments, proxy war, and war. U.S. policymakers just get to do what they want. We don't have any kind of voice in that. Nothing. Capture of U.S. foreign policy mission by the Department of Defense and CIA missions, by corporations, and by U.S. policymakers' personal pecuniary interests. And I mention this in the solutions too, that the Department of Defense and CIA, when they're spying or the military's training or developing a plan of defense, that's all good. That's part of their mission. The problem is their mission should not be dominating the U.S. foreign policy mission. But they are dominating the mission. Therefore, policymakers only think in terms of third facet solutions, of fighting, of hostility, of defeating the enemy. They don't think in terms of understanding, because understanding and communication are not part of the missions of the Department of Defense and the CIA. Another legal escalator of violence is the undemocratic influence of lobbyists, the weapon industry, fossil fuel and nuclear industries. Also, the right-wing Ukrainian lobbyists are creating a very skewed picture. It's not just, it's extreme right-wing Ukrainian lobbyists they have been creating an extreme picture, which fills the ears of U.S. policymakers. They're inundating Washington, D.C. I mean, they have more lobbyists making contacts down there than the Saudis, which are huge lobbyists. connection of money to political power in the U.S. system. It's not a democracy here. It's a plutocracy. And that makes the U.S. foreign policy much more hostile. Because when you are fueled by money and you're led by money, you think in terms of money, you don't have heart, you don't have spirit, you're missing 3/4 of your brain, of your human potential. You're only thinking in these very narrow base terms of life. Physical escalators of U.S. violence. Sending weapons to escalate civil war and provoke Russian invasions. This happened in Afghanistan in 1979. 6 months prior to the invasion, Carter and Brzezinski were arming the Mujahideen there, and they knew it would provoke the Soviet Union. Brzezinski admitted this in 1998, that they were provoking the Soviet Union to invade. And they did it again when Russia invaded in 2022. That was a provoked invasion. Why do you think the U.S. media keeps saying entirely unprovoked, entirely unprovoked? Because it was provoked, and they're trying to brainwash everybody. Okay, also, physical escalators of violence, the existence of abominable, blasphemous weapons. I say blasphemous because human beings should not have this much power over each other, over other species of life, over the planet. It's blasphemous. Especially with the lack of social evolution, the lack of psychological evolution. People are not responsible enough to even handle these weapons. And if they were responsible enough to handle these weapons, they wouldn't even want them. Nuclear, chemical, biological, bombs, including, especially from aircraft. That's terrifying. That's awful. Drones, any kind of high kill, fast kill, sloppy kill weapon, that is totally irresponsible. No reasonable judgment goes behind that type of killing. Not that I'm advocating any kind of killing. But you don't even have time when you have a fast kill, multi-person kill weapon to decide, oh, do these people really need to be killed in order to save us, in order to save freedom, or are they really bad people? Lack of democratic control over weapon manufacturing, despite its use of public taxes and its public consequences. I say the weapon industry can't have it two ways. They can't get public handouts from our taxes and then have private decision-making about what they're developing, what they're selling, what they're exporting. Okay, if they're going to use our taxes to the extent that they do to fund, have all those government contracts, then they have to be under our control. What's manufactured, how much is manufactured, whom it's sold to, how often. So those are the escalators of violence. Next, we move on to the solutions. So, first of all, I'll show you the chart. 3 facets of solutions that Paradigm for Peace model envisions. First facet, solutions, largely mental, emotional, spiritual tools as well. Some physical tools like the idea of play, having fun, physical fun. Anything that helps human development. This is enormously neglected. It's the most important one we've got to put on center stage. Second facet, legal tools of justice, of making things fair between people. Third facet, physical tools, which could be violent or non-violent. And I'll run through them because I just did a video when I went through them very carefully. We'll just run through them. First facet, mental tools of human development. Number 1, cooperative dialogue. Get on the phone with Putin. Not a debate, not silencing, and show some empathy. Listen. Understand his fears and resolve them cooperatively. Integrative negotiation, not power-based negotiation. It's a cooperative form of negotiation, egalitarian. Sue the U.S. media, the CIA if it's behind it, for libel. It's awful, the propaganda that lies. Sue them. And for recklessness in creating these lies. Publicly evaluate U.S. policymakers' psychological patterns. Make it, not to shame them, with compassion, okay, but to talk about it in a serious, caring way, but alarmed way too, that we can't have certain patterns dominating U.S. foreign policy making. Russian U.S. prejudice reduction programs. We need them. Publicly evaluate globalization market system. Don't just assume the whole world needs them and that they promote peace and democracy. Reform culture and organization subcultures of competition, rivalry, status, greed. Extremely important because the same dynamics that occur on the international stage are happening within U.S. government and within U.S. organizations. And we have to take care of these sicknesses within people and between people so that they can have positive forms of self-esteem, positive friendships, without this competition, these negative aspects of life. Publicly fund impartial media with 360-degree comprehensive reporting and empathy and nonviolent conflict resolution skills. Develop constructive, not destructive intelligence. In other words, intelligence that we can gain in a friendly way by talking to people. What are your fears? How would you like us to address your fears? If you could have 3 wishes, what would you like us to do differently? What do you think you can do differently? That's constructive intelligence. Destructive, okay, where's he going to be at this time? All right, we'll bomb him then. Destructive intelligence. Or gain through torture sometimes. Tell me where the weapons are. Who do you know in this organization? All right, then we can go kill him. Enough of that, okay? We need constructive intelligence. Require U.S. leaders to have proven record of impartial analysis, integrative negotiation, cooperative dialogue, and nonviolent conflict resolution skills. Require it. Talk about it in the campaigns. Expose the history of anti-Russian propaganda in the U.S. government, media, movies, and TV shows. Talk about it. Show exactly how it's created and what's false about it. Demand that U.S. leaders prioritize caring for enemies, not conquering them. Okay, we have to evolve. Expose demagoguery in U.S. leadership. We are good, they are evil, we must defeat or kill them. Again, we've got to evolve well beyond that. Stop forcing us to believe that their enemies, the U.S. policymakers' enemies, are our enemies. Okay, this is just nonsense. Okay, we have to evolve past this. Require policymaker training in nurturant model foreign relations and negotiation. Nurturant model with an emphasis on understanding, mutual caring, egalitarianism, questioning the rules. Second facet, legal tools of justice. Forbid U.S. fossil fuel and weapon industry involvement in the Black, Caspian, Arctic, and South China Seas. If you forbid that, I think that will go a long way to reducing conflict. Stop using tax dollars to fund fossil fuel, nuclear, and weapon development. Okay? Our tax dollars aren't here to serve these industries. Government is to serve us. Do not submerge the U.S. foreign policy mission to the Department of Defense and CIA to personal pecuniary interests of policymakers and corporations. Okay? And I'm not saying the Department of Defense and CIA are to blame for causing the mission to be submerged to them. There's like the Department of State isn't really doing. The Department of State is more like a non-violent version of the Department of Defense. We need something like a Department of Peace, which actually goes about this in the way I'm talking about, to create peace, gathering constructive intelligence. Require a sound decision-making process with a comprehensive exchange of information with the public regarding war, proxy war, weapon shipments and sales, and weapon manufacturing. Prohibit U.S. policymaker personal investments in weapons, nuclear, private military contractor, and fossil fuel industries. Vigorously promote non-nuclear, non-fossil fuel forms of energy and transportation. Vigorously. Forbid all campaign contributions and publicly fund all campaigns for office equally. We've got to get money out of the picture so we can get a different type of psychological pattern creating our foreign policy. One that's not a slave to money. Enforce international law. Prosecute U.S. presidents and top officials for violations of international law, including invasions, coups, torture, detention, drones, and lies. Hold them responsible. Shrink NATO infrastructure and capability to levels in 1997 when NATO-Russia Founding Act signed. Create a U.S. Department of Peace, as former Congressman Dennis Kucinich several times. He introduced the bill to do that. Greatly curtail or eliminate the CIA and the National Endowment for Democracy. Third facet, physical tools of physical control. These can be, I'm going to mention here the top solutions for all of these. There are many more solutions also. The most important things immediately Abolish and dismantle nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons immediately. Start today. Notice what happens to conflict. It's going to help a lot. Work for international ban on aircraft bombs and drones. We don't need things dropping out of the sky on us. Greatly curtail U.S. weapon exports of both U.S. government foreign military and direct commercial sales. Immediately cease weapon sales for proxy war, such as what Biden's doing right now in Ukraine. Stop it right now. That is escalating the war and the killing and making everything worse. If they stop that, it's not going to cause... the U.S. media painted a picture that, oh, if we don't arm them, this evil Russia is just going to take over and smash Ukraine and dissolve it. Putin never wanted to do that. He was trying to have a limited military operation to protect Donetsk and Lugansk. And probably to keep NATO out also. But the U.S. policymakers, by sending weapons, they're escalating their conflict. Stop those weapon shipments. Forbid weapon sales that could possibly jeopardize nonviolent conflict resolution. The people who are trying for nonviolence are just being stampeded and killed by those who want violent solutions. Give the Pentagon and NATO, either dissolve NATO or limit it, or give the NATO, along with the Pentagon, a sense of purpose by redirecting the entire mission to nonviolent cooperative conflict resolution, to natural disaster and climate rescue, with military ops and espionage only a small unit. Okay, I don't know what to do about NATO, but I say with Pentagon, if we could, it's important to give it a sense of purpose. You need to keep military operations, obviously. You need an army and a navy. But we don't want it to expand its violence just to give it a sense of purpose. So give it a sense of purpose by doing these other things. I think the people in the military would really appreciate that. I think they'd feel really good about themselves. Okay? You won't have all these suicides either. Expand and specify criteria for a just war, proxy war, and weapon exports. As I say in the last video, I'm not in favor of war, but I think it's important to have criteria for a just war. And these criteria themselves can actually prevent war by forcing policymakers to think through these things. Criteria should be merit of goals, in the plural, and absence of unjust goals. So not just, oh, we have a just purpose. Okay, maybe you have one just purpose, supposedly. But what are all your goals? Are all of them just? Are any of them unjust? If they are, scrap this idea of war or proxy war or weapon shipments. Require social, psychological, and environmental impact statements of proposed wars, proxy wars, and weapon shipments, and of past ones. There has to be, in order for these things to be approved, war, proxy war, there has to be a net gain for goodness. You have to decide what's going to be called, what are the pros and what are the cons. The pros have to include feelings of love, feelings of trust, friendship, joy, security. Cons have to include things like PTSD, borderline personality disorder, all sorts of traumatic conditions that can result from trauma, the loss of trust, which causes the civil war, which increases the aggressive violence. Okay? And also it has to be a net gain for goodness on all sides of war in order for a war to be approved. Not just one side of war. Then, not only does there have to be a net gain for goodness with no unjust goals at all, but you have to compare the net gain from war to alternative, non-violent approaches to achieve each goal. So if you say, oh, this war is going to prevent torture, okay, is there a non-violent approach to prevent torture? And which one will do it better? Competent, legitimate authority guided by truthful, cooperative quest discussion, not just party members intimidating other party members and telling them to vote for a war or a proxy war or weapons shipments. Truthful, comprehensive exchange of information and perspectives with the public, not brainwashing. Last resort. You've got to go through all these steps and many more before you come to war. War is the very, very last resort. Or proxy war or weapon shipments. They should also be a last resort. I mean, the U.S. gets all upset about drugs coming in from Mexico. the weapon shipments going to Mexico from the United States, why don't they talk about that? I mean, some people do, in the alternative news. The weapon shipments are far worse, far more serious. And also, there has to be a high probability of success based on logic, not stupid little assumptions and magical thinking, and planning of steps, including post-conflict steps. And my hope is that if they actually plan the steps of the conflict, they might realize, oh, you know, this isn't going to work necessarily. If they plan the post-conflict steps, they might say, you know, we can do this without the war. We can start doing this. We don't need the war before we start doing these things, like have prejudice reduction programs, or help them build their infrastructure, or help them with their court system. Then there have to be what I call Da Vinci standards. Leonardo da Vinci, oh, my time is almost up. He drew a submarine 400 years before it was created. He showed it to no one because he felt more people than not are greedy and power hungry. A submarine in their hands is dangerous. He hid it. Where are those standards? We need to get those standards of humanity back. Outlaw high kill, clumsy kill, future kill weapons. Outlaw wasteful uses of energy, money, and lives, such as bombs. Outlaw torture instruments and procedures, as international law has done. Enforce geographical limitations on war, not in neighborhoods, just in a battlefield. And the call law, what I call Clean Air, Water, and Land Act in War. If you're going to have a war, you've got to keep the air, land, and water clean. How are you going to do it? Improve it. So those are the 3 facets of solutions, and those are the top solutions that I'm suggesting. The 4th, I'm going to be cut off, so before I want to thank you very, very much for listening. But Paradigm for Peace has a 4th element, which is cooperative dialogue, and that's the foundation of the whole thing. Americans have to be able to talk amongst themselves, within government, and internationally, cooperatively, really caring, putting yourself in the other's shoes, sincerely. That's how we can create peace, and that's what we have to do to create peace. So I hope you can spread these ideas. And remember, one-sided empathy is dangerous. We need 360-degree empathy, 360-degree reporting, and caring about the so-called enemy. Satisfying their legitimate grievances is not appeasement. It is decent, human, just, fair behavior. Thank you very, very much. This is the end, and I might get cut off. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your comments. Please, please, if you like the video or any parts of it, please send the YouTube channel link or links to certain videos to friends or acquaintances or to policy makers, media makers. Piggyback off these ideas and make your own videos. We've got to do something to stop what's going on right now. It's extremely dangerous. So don't. I thank you so much for listening, but I ask that you please do something more now. You probably already are. Send it on. Try to get these ideas and your own ideas publicized. Please. If you want, hold cooperative dialogues and get them filmed. Make a film. Or a TV show if you have that. Or a YouTube show. Act out the different roles. Pretend you're Putin and Biden and do an ideal conversation. Get theater groups involved. I have to do other things now that I've been neglecting. That's why I did this grand finale. I did the grand finale because things are so dangerous. That's why I jumped to it. I have other essays I could do, but when I get back to this, it'll be to try to publicize it more, and also I've been trying to publish my works, my books, if there's a planet around to read them, and I'll probably work on that. But if you'd like, please subscribe, and the little bell notification you can click on, and that way if I do have another video that comes out, you'll get notification of it. But thank you very, very much, and you're very nice people, and the comments were really nice in the emails to me. Thank you. Take great care, and I really hope we can get through this. Okay? but we've got to act. Thank you. Good night.